Moses had an eye problem, not with his physical eyes, but with his ego. And you may not realize it, but you may have a similar problem as well. And the antidote to it, that eye problem, is to put our vision on God and what God can do and put Him at the center instead of focusing on ourselves. Now, we think of ego a lot of times as just having to do with arrogance and pride. That's only half of it. On one hand, you have the person who says, I'm fantastic. On the other hand is the person who says, I'm a failure. Now, one person will say, I can do this, I've got this, I'm smart, I'm wise, I'm strong, I'm capable. On the other hand, you have a person who says, I can't do this, I'll never measure up, I can't succeed, I'm weak, I'm inadequate. You see, what both of those have in common is the word I. I can do this, or I can't do this. Both of those are an expression of ego. Both of those are I problems. They're focusing on ourselves instead of God. And whenever we say I can't do it or I can do it, we've put the focus on ourselves instead of relying on God and what God can do. So the first thing that we learn from the example of Moses is that we need to rely on God and not on ourselves. You see, God had a plan for Moses. He was going to use him to deliver the Israelites from slavery in Egypt, but Moses wasn't ready for that because he hadn't learned to rely on God's power yet. Now, Moses was educated in Pharaoh's household. He grew up as part of Pharaoh's family. But as he grew older, he began to take an interest in his own people, the Israelites. And one day, as he was out watching the Israelites, he saw the injustices that were being done to them, and he decided to take action. We see that in Exodus chapter 2. During his visit, Moses saw an Egyptian beating one of his fellow Hebrews. After looking in all directions to make sure no one was watching, Moses killed the Egyptian and hid the body in the sand. Moses' crime was soon discovered, and he had to flee far away from Egypt to save his life. He ended up in the desert of Midian, far away from Egypt, and he adopted the lifestyle of an obscure and lowly shepherd. We see that in Exodus chapter 2, and he lived that way for 40 years. So the lesson here is that Moses was focused on himself and what he could do, on what he could accomplish. He was confident in his own abilities. God had to humble him. A lot of times God humbles us to teach us to rely on Him and not ourselves. And now, while he's in that condition, God came to Moses. He appeared to him in Exodus chapter 3. And in verses 7 through 10, God says to Moses, now's the time that I want to deliver Israel from slavery, and I'm calling you to do it. Now's the time. And Moses didn't want to do it. He had several excuses, 5 of them in particular, for why he wasn't going to do what God called him to do. He became paralyzed by these inadequacies and weaknesses that kept him from embracing God's plan for his life. And so, you see, Moses is still focused on himself. Now it's not on what he could do. Instead, now it's on what he couldn't do. And so he had to learn to shift his focus from himself to God. And as we look at God's interaction with Moses through these 5 excuses, we're going to learn some lessons ourselves. Number 1 is we're going to learn to rely on God's presence. So in the old day, young Moses in his pride would have said, I can do this. I can take on Pharaoh. But now look at what Moses said 40 years later in chapter 3, verse 11. But Moses said to God, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? And God said, I will be with you. So Moses, in his paralysis of his inadequacy, says, who am I to do this? I can't do this. I'm old. I'm a shepherd. I'm a nobody. I tried it once. It didn't work. But God says, it doesn't matter who you are. What matters is who is with you. Moses had to learn that he could do it, not in his own strength, not in his own ability, but he could do it because God was with him. Now, the second excuse that Moses made teaches us a lesson as well, and from that we learn to rely on God's person. So proud Moses years ago would have gone to the Israelites and said, God sent me, you're going to follow me, I'm going to lead you out of Israel. Just believe. If you don't believe me, that's too bad. But now 40 years later in Exodus chapter 3, here's what Moses said to God. Suppose I go to the Israelites and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they ask me, what's his name? Then what shall I tell them? God said to Moses, I am who I am. This is what you are to say to the Israelites. I am has sent me to you. God also said to Moses, say to the Israelites, the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, has sent me to you. So paralyzed Moses, in his sense of inadequacy, says, how am I going to convince these people that I'm really representing you, that you're the one who sent me? And so God made it clear to him who he really was. He says, I am the eternal God of the universe, the God of your forefathers. And he made it clear to Moses how he was to explain God to the people that he was going to try to reach. And so Moses had to learn that he could do this, that he could convince people not based on his own adequacy or his own strength, but based on who God really is. And so Moses still has the focus on himself. He still has a vision problem. And as we get to his third excuse, this is where we're going to learn to rely on God's power. Proud Moses might have said, I'm powerful. My mother is the daughter of Pharaoh. I have all the resources of the Egyptian kingly court at my disposal. But now, 40 years later, in chapter 4, verse 1, look at how Moses answered God. Moses answered, what if they do not believe me or listen to me and say, the Lord did not appear to you? Then the Lord said to him, what is that in your hand? A staff, he replied. The Lord said, throw it on the ground. Moses threw it on the ground, and it became a snake, and he ran from it. Then the Lord said to him, reach out your hand and take it by the tail. So Moses reached out and took hold of the snake, and it turned back into a staff in his hand. So paralyzed by his sense of inadequacy, Moses says, how are they going to know that you sent me? What if they challenge me? What am I going to say to them? And God says, don't say anything. Let me show you something. God gave him a miraculous sign to convince the people that Moses really did represent him. And in fact, if you read on in chapter 4, God gave him 2 other signs as well, not just the rod and the snake, but 2 other signs as well. And so Moses had to learn that people would listen to him, that he really could represent God, but only by God's power, not by his own inadequacy, to stop worrying about what his own abilities were and to start focusing on what God's power was all about. Now, the fourth excuse that Moses made teaches us another lesson. It teaches us that we need to learn to rely on God's provision. Proud Moses back in the day would have said, look at me, I've been educated with all the wisdom and the sophistication of the Egyptians, who were like the highest, the most intellectual and advanced people of their day. But look what Moses says 40 years later in Exodus chapter 4. Moses said to the Lord, pardon your servant, Lord. I've never been eloquent, neither in the past nor since you have spoken to your servant. I am slow of speech and in tongue. The Lord said to him, who gave human beings their mouths? Who makes them deaf or mute? Who gives them sight or makes them blind? Is it not I, the Lord? Now go, I'll help you speak and will teach you what to say. So paralyzed Moses says, God, I'm lousy with words. I can't be your spokesman because I'm not really good at speaking. And God said, you know what? Who made your mouth? Wasn't it me? Didn't I make you who you are? And besides that, I'll help you. I'll provide. I'll teach you what to say. So Moses had to learn that he could do something difficult, that he could do something that he didn't feel came natural to him, and he could do it because God would provide whatever he needed. Now, Moses still has one more excuse, but you can see that his focus is still on himself, and he's still trying to figure out how to shift his focus to God. And in his fifth excuse, here's what we learn. We learn to rely on God's perspective. So proud Moses says, I'll do it, I'm the one, and I'll start by getting rid of this Egyptian. That's how he acted when he was young, in his pride and self-sufficiency. But now look 40 years later at what happens in Exodus 4, verse 13. But Moses said, pardon your servant, Lord. Please send someone else. Then the Lord's anger burned against Moses, and he said, what about your brother Aaron the Levite? He's already on his way to meet you. You shall speak to him and put words in his mouth. I will help both of you speak and will teach you what to do. So paralyzed by his inadequacies, Moses said, look, God, I just don't want to do it. God, I just want you to find somebody else. And God says, no, Moses, you're the one I've chosen. That's the end of the story. I'm going to help you. I'm going to provide someone to come alongside you, but you're the one, and that's my plan, and that's what's going to be best. And so Moses had to learn that God had the right perspective on things, that God's plan really is best, and that God really did know best. And so eventually Moses got it. And he took the focus off his own strengths. He took the focus off his own weaknesses. He started to focus on how great God is and what God could do. And you see that way he began to go into action. Exodus 4 verse 20 tells us what happened. Moses took his wife and sons and put them on a donkey and headed back to the land of Egypt. So what made the difference for Moses? He became convinced of God's ability. He became convinced of how great God was and what God could do. And so as he took the focus off of himself, put his focus on God, things changed for him. And so instead of I can or I can't, it becomes God can. And as you rely on who God is and what he's able to do and what he's done, then you can take action to fulfill whatever God has called you to do.